Hey everybody, welcome to a very special episode of the Food History Happy Hour. I'm your host, Sarah Wasberg-Johnson, and tonight we are going to be talking about Halloween foods, right? It's All Hallows Eve, the Friday before Halloween. I have my little spider friend with me on my hat. So we're going to be talking about Halloween history. We're going to be talking about Halloween food history. All right, so tonight's cocktail is called the Stone Fence. There are lots of different ways to make it, which is part of the reason why I need viewer input. So it is fairly old. It dates back to the 19th century. I think Jerry Thomas in 1862 is one of the first people to popularize this drink, but it does show up a lot of different places. Throughout history, I first encountered it in the 1946 Roving Bartender, which is one of my favorite bartender's guides. And there's lots of different ways to make it, but the basic ingredients are you need hard cider. I have Strongbow, which is kind of, not as sweet as I would probably prefer. Hey, Glenn, yay! So I'm on your TV screen now. That's pretty cool. But anyway, so the Stone Fence is hard cider and then usually 1 or 2 ounces of some kind of brown liquor. So the 1946 guide said whiskey. Other recipes I ran into called first rum, which I completely bought spiced rum specifically for this recipe because that's what I thought the recipe said, but it actually says whiskey. And then, of course, I've also seen versions with bourbon. And some versions call for Angostura bitters. So, my lovely viewers, on this Halloween Eve, it's choose your own adventure cocktail time. So, obviously, the hard cider is the primary ingredient, so you can't leave that out. But I would like you to vote for whether or not you would like spiced rum or bourbon, and don't say both because I'm not doing both. And then whether or not you think I should add bitters. So vote away in the comments section, please. I'm interested to see where this goes. All right, Heather votes for rum. Any other takers for rum? That's kind of what I was feeling tonight, but I thought I'd leave it up to you guys. Whiskey and rum are probably equally authentic to the early 19th century, both being very popular liquors at the time. Okay, Rosemary votes for rum. Any other takers for rum? So far it's rum 2, whiskey's bourbon 0. Liz says rum. We have a lot of rum lovers tonight, I think. It is spiced rum, so that feels appropriate for the season. All right. Any other votes? All right, Glenn says rum too. Okay, that's 4 votes for rum, and there's only 8 people watching, so unless the other 4 people want bourbon, I think we're going to go ahead and go with rum. So I have my little highball glass. Oh, we have secondary votes. Mike and Mel are also rum. I was really not expecting this to be a landslide vote for rum, you guys. Hey. It's an election. It's a Stone Fence election. And Glenn, I would agree that if we're using spiced rum, I'm not going to put bitters in, right? All right. So this is a very straightforward recipe. Some recipes call for ice. My cider is chilled. I wasn't really feeling like getting ice tonight. So a lot of recipes call for 2 ounces of brown liquor. I'm just going to do 1 because I'm kind of a lightweight. And I feel like alcohol, like hard liquor plus hard cider, probably not the greatest. I do also have to work in the morning, so. All right. Oh, it smells nice. There's my 1 ounce of spiced rum. Put the cap back on. If you're watching, say hi in the comments. Also, I don't know if anybody saw my fake candles that I put up for Halloween, and I don't know if you can see in the back behind my hat, but I have more candles and little pumpkins. Because it's Halloween, so I decorated the Food Historian Library. All right. Now, a lot of people you will see on the internet, because I did a little research trying to figure out what to make tonight, a lot of people will confuse hard cider with sweet cider, which is a common mistake to make. Oh, am I going to fit the whole bottle in? Look at that. The roving bartender just has to fill with hard cider, so I just filled it, and it took the whole bottle, so that's nice. It said specifically a highball glass. I have my pretty little copper reusable straw. It's not actually copper, it's just copper colored. Thanks, Rosemary. This is my favorite hat. All right, so this is the Stone Fence. It is a mixture of 1 ounce spiced rum filled with hard cider, and I used Strongbow artisanal blend because that's a little less sweet than a lot of modern hard ciders, and I thought that would be more historically accurate to the early 19th century. So here we go. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, spiced rum was a good choice, you guys. Thanks for that. That's fairly delicious. It's pretty alcoholic, you know, obviously, clearly more alcoholic than just regular hard cider, but it's more mellow than I thought. Yum. Perfect. Perfect for Halloween. Yeah, so should anyone have hard cider and rum in their houses right now, please feel free to join me with a Stone Fence. Now, I chose the Stone Fence because last time Neil DiMarino, who's also a food historian, suggested this for Halloween. And it is very appropriate for Halloween because the time period that this really dates to, the early 19th century, was when Halloween was getting started in the United States. Rum, whiskey or bourbon, and hard cider were like the drinks of choice for regular people. Elizabeth said, I've heard that cider with Fireball is delicious, although not historically accurate. If you didn't have spiced rum, you could use that. I'm sure it would be delicious, but it is not historically accurate. That's okay, though. That's okay. We don't have to be historically accurate in our everyday lives. We just need to be historically accurate when we're talking about history, right? So the 1840s-ish is really when Halloween starts to be imported, and that coincides with Irish immigration. So there were some kind of Halloween-y things existing prior to that. I think in large part because of Scottish immigration, which was much earlier, dating back to the 18th century. But it's really not until the mid to late 19th century that Halloween starts to take off as sort of a more national holiday, and particularly in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Like, that's the golden age of Halloween. So Halloween is primarily in the United States, comes from a Celtic background, right? Halloween is short for All Hallows Eve. Halloween, right, with the apostrophe in the middle instead of Hallow-even for evening. And that is the night before All Souls Day, right, which is a Christian holiday celebrating, I forget how they phrase it, but basically the faithful dead, right, saints, martyrs, and people who've gone before us. And that is really a Christian adaptation of an ancient Celtic holiday called Samhain. It looks like it's spelled Samhain, but because it's Gaelic, and Gaelic has a tendency to pronounce things very differently from how you think they would be, because of how they're spelled, right? So it looks like it'd be pronounced one way in English, but it's totally not. So it's pronounced Samhain. And that is a very similar festival about kind of honoring the dead, the ancestors. And it's a time of year when the veil between the worlds grows thin, right? So it's Samhain is considered a cross-quarter holiday, so it's at the halfway point between the fall equinox and the winter solstice. And so when the British Isles get Christianized, the Catholic Church sort of adopts that with All Souls Day. So Halloween becomes kind of the creepier version, right, to the actual Catholic holiday. So there's a couple of traditions associated with this, one of which is dressing up as scary things to scare away the actual supernatural scary things, right? So that's kind of where the tradition of dressing up comes from. Associated with All Souls Day, you have people who would go from door to door, largely poor and indigenous people going from door to door, begging for food in exchange for praying for the souls of your dearly departed, right? Which kind of goes along with trick-or-treating. There's also a 12th night connection in the British Isles. 12th night has a lot of mumming traditions. So mumming is like when you get dressed up and parade around. So there's the mumming tradition, and then there's also the wassailing tradition, which is when you go from door to door and basically you sing your wassail song, and if they don't give you the good stuff, you might beat them up, right? So that's a little bit of a trick-or-treat. So these are kind of the traditions that all get brought to the United States and sort of transform into Halloween. All right, John has a question. John says, which one is more historically accurate, bourbon, rye, or rum? They all probably would have been historically accurate. I think probably for Halloween, specifically if we're talking about Celtic traditions and Irish immigration, I think whiskey and corn liquor were probably more historically accurate to like the Appalachian region, which is where a lot of early Scotch-Irish settlers end up. But definitely colonial New England, rum could have been just as accurate. I could kind of go any of those directions depending. Because of course the hard cider was consumed throughout the colonies and early America. Pretty much anywhere you could grow apples. You know, maybe south of the Carolinas, it gets a little tougher to grow apples because they need a certain number of cold days below freezing in the wintertime in order to get a decent apple crop, basically. But yeah, I think it really depended on your regionality, which is probably why stone fence is so variable. You know, whatever brown liquor you had around is what you used. All right, so that's kind of an overview of Halloween. Before I get into some of the tricks and treats and parties history, does anyone have any questions? I'm going to take a little sip of my drink. If you're just joining us, I'm drinking the Stone Fence. My recipe that I use, thanks to viewer input, is an ounce of spiced rum, and I filled it with basically an entire bottle of hard cider, but there's lots of variations. So all right, if there aren't any more questions, I'm just going to keep going. So those of you who are Patreon patrons, thank you so much for being Patreon patrons. You hopefully have gotten your Halloween packets in the mail. If not, I did post a downloadable digital version. But that's something I did a lot of research for that I'm kind of going to recycle a little bit tonight for the rest of you. And I talked a lot about the history of Halloween parties, right? So that's something that Halloween parties really, and I was talking about this with some of my friends who have kids who are really disappointed that a lot of them can't go trick-or-treating this year. And I reminded them that trick-or-treating is a fairly recent invention, at least trick-or-treating as we know it, really only dates back to like the 1940s and 50s. And I'll get to why in a minute. But parties at home were the norm pretty much for the entire history of Halloween. Like you might have a community party in a public hall, but a lot of people, particularly in the late 19th century, were having parties at home. And there's this interesting little side thing happening with these Halloween parties in that they're really a place for young people, single young people looking for romance, to meet, right? To meet members of the opposite sex. Because, of course, in the 19th century, there weren't a ton of opportunities to do that. And so a lot of the traditions around Halloween are associated with divination. And that divination is associated with figuring out who you're going to marry, which is a pretty important thing in a young person's life in the 19th century. I'm going to pause for a drink and answer a couple questions. So Andy asks, how many liters or gallons of witch's brew can your hat hold? I don't know. It probably depends if it's straightened out or not. It's a pretty big hat. I like that it's a huge hat. Glenn says he's drinking the amazing, haha pun, corn lager that Carla bought for him. Interesting. Oh, and yay, you're welcome, Cammie. I'm so glad it arrived in the mail in time. I was really worried. You know, I was going to send it on Monday, and then my printer was not printing, and I couldn't figure out why, and it turns out I was out of paper. And I was really out of paper. I had to go buy more paper. So I got them all printed and in the mail. They went in the mail like 4:45 on Tuesday. So I'm glad that they came in time for Halloween. So I got excited about that. All right, anyway, back to parties. So a lot of Halloween parties, particularly in the early 20th century, were very homemade affairs. There's lots of advice in there about how to make your own decorations. The vast majority of foods associated with these parties were homemade and not what we might typically think of Halloween food, which I'll get to in a minute. And then, of course, they were designed for young people to come together, to have a good time, and to mingle and maybe figure out who you're going to marry. So some of the divination games that people would play, and some of these are very old, like if you had a fire in the hearth, which of course that lends a lot of ambiance to Halloween, you could put 2 chestnuts, whole chestnuts, on the hearth. And of course, if you've ever roasted chestnuts, you know that you have to score the ends or they explode. Well, that was part of the fun for Halloween. So you put your whole chestnuts on the hearth next to each other, right? One to represent you and one to represent your potential spouse. And how they reacted to the fire would predict how your relationship went. So if they burned steadily and like cozied up to each other the whole time, that was very good sign for the future of your relationship. But if they sputtered or like bounced around or exploded, that was a very bad sign for your potential relationship, right? So that's one example. A lot of them are specifically geared at young women. So for example, you have an apple. A lot of you have probably heard this one. And if you peel the peel from the apple in one continuous piece, you can't break it. You have to get the whole peel off in one piece. And then you would toss it over your shoulder and think of the one that you wanted to marry. And when you turn around, you would see how the peel fell. And if it was in the shape of a letter, that would be the name of the person you were going to marry. Another one, a lot of them take place at midnight. Another one is if you had a mirror, right, and a candle, you would take a candle and look in a mirror at midnight. And no, you wouldn't say Bloody Mary. But you would hold the candle and look in the mirror at midnight in a dark room, and you would be able to see behind you the reflection of a man. And that man was the person that you were going to marry. So there's all kinds of these things. There's other ones where you could bake a cake with fortunes in it. There were fortune-telling games. People did palm reading. People did card reading. I actually have in the packet how you can read fortunes with regular playing cards, which is kind of fun. People had fortune-telling games, right? Like board games and wheels that you would spin. So a lot of it was trying to figure out who you're going to marry, which I think is fantastically fun. And I probably would have been totally mortified if someone had tried to do that with me in high school. But it would have been, you know, it could have been fun. I think people were a little more honest in the 19th and early 20th century about looking for marriage, right? Not so much anymore. We tend to be a little more circumspect about it. But that was one of the main themes behind those parties. They did also have parties for kids. A very old game, actually a series of very old games. There are a lot of games that involve apples and donuts. And I don't know if you know, but apparently this week is National Donut Week, which is very appropriate because donuts are very strongly associated with Halloween. I'm not really sure why. They just are. So one of the games, for instance, I'm sure most of you have heard of bobbing for apples. But they also had something called Snap Apple, which is it was either a wheel or like a cross of sticks or sometimes just one stick. And you would suspend it in the middle from a string. And on one end, there would be an apple. And on the other end, there would be a lit candle. And this, you know, stick or wheel would be sent spinning and kind of swinging from the string hung from the ceiling. And you would have to try, with only using your mouth, no hands, right? Just your mouth. Try to capture the apple and get it off the stick before you got hit in the face with the lit candle. I have seen other versions where the other end is a little cloth bag filled with flour, which is far less dangerous. But then obviously if you get hit in the face with that, it's going to fly flour all over your face and all over your clothes. So you want to avoid that. Hi, Eleanor. Thanks for joining us. We are just talking about Halloween games and food-related ones. So that's Snap Apple, right? And then, of course, you also have bobbing for apples, which a lot of people don't really do anymore because it's not super hygienic. Oh, Elizabeth, I just watched Edwardian Farm the other day on BBC. That's been like my pandemic guilty pleasure. For those of you who don't know, the BBC has a couple of archaeologists and historians. The main historian, the domestic historian, is Ruth Goodman. She's fantastic. They did a whole series of these films a number of years ago, probably about going on 10 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to think about. But one they did is called Edwardian Farm, which is available for purchase on Amazon Prime, which is where I got it. And it's 12 episodes, and it follows these three historians kind of reliving life in the Edwardian period on a farm in Cornwall in the Tamar River Valley. And Elizabeth is right. They do have an episode about Halloween, and they do play Snap Apple with a live candle, which is a little bit crazy. But of course, Peter is able to get the apple. I don't think they're swinging it very fast. So he is able to get the apple with his mouth, and he gets it off the stick. So, of course, he wins. Yes, they also did Victorian Farm, which is great. And my favorite is Wartime Farm, which is about World War II. So anyway, that was Snap Apple. They did also have bobbing for apples, which is kind of similar. There is another version of Snap Apple that involves a donut. Not always tied to a stick with a candle on the other end, but there's a similar game where you suspend donuts from a string, and then you have to get them off the string with your hands tied behind your back. And I think the really difficult thing is to get them off the string without dropping any of it on the floor, right? Because who wants to waste delicious donuts? I don't. And just so you know, like the historic donuts, there's two kinds. There's the yeasted kind that we're all familiar with, usually not in a round shape with a hole. That comes much later. Often they were twists or strips. And And then, of course, there's also cake donuts. Now, my favorite type of donut is a type of donut that a bakery made near my house when I was like in high school. This is where we lived. And Andy, Homer Simpson accepts your challenge. Homer Simpson would be very good at the donut on a string challenge. Yes, he would. But my favorite type of donut is a cake donut, flavored with fresh nutmeg. They're not very sweet, and they're fried to like a crispy golden brown on the outside, and they're soft and fairly dense but tender on the inside. And they're not super sweet. So I think that would be a particularly good donut for this game because they're dense enough that, you know, they're going to put up a little resistance if you try to pull them off the string. So you really have to eat it off the string. And they're not so sweet that if you go after a bunch of donuts, you're going to eat yourself sick, right? And those, I think, are really the type of donuts that they talk about, because donuts are a main feature of Halloween parties, of Halloween menus from this time period, from the late 19th and early 20th century. All right, I'm taking a drink. Any other comments or questions before I move on? For those of you who are just joining us, we're drinking the Stone Fence cocktail, which dates back to the early 19th century, but Jerry Thomas popularizes it in the 1860s, 1862. But I found it as late as the 1940s. So it's pretty delicious. I used spiced rum and hard cider, but you can use any brown liquor and hard cider. If you don't use spiced rum, if you use whiskey or bourbon, you might want to put a little Angostura bitters in there. My mom is watching. Hi, Mom. Mom commented that my favorite type of donut is the kind of donut that my great-grandmothers made, which is probably why I love it so much. When I was a kid, I definitely liked the sweeter donuts, so I probably did not appreciate great-grandma donuts when my grandmas were alive, because they both passed away when I was in 7th grade. But definitely as an adult, those are the kinds of donuts I like. And they're very difficult to find. I feel like I need to learn how to make donuts. I'm secretly terrified, not so secretly terrified, of deep fat frying. Maybe I need to get an electric one, right? Just slightly safer, and try and make my own. Mom, do you have the recipe? We should try and find out. Hi, Anna. Thanks for joining. I'm glad you joined us, even though you forgot. Thank you for compliments about my hair. I try. Okay, so that's a little bit about donuts and parties, and we talked about games. So now I want to talk about menus, Halloween party menus from the turn of the 20th century. So nowadays, when we think about Halloween menus, especially for kids' parties, we probably think about foods that try to replicate disgusting things. Like I've seen going around the internet, the hot dogs cut into thin strips and cooked in tomato sauce so that they get all curly and creepy looking, and that's supposed to be like worms. And then you either put it on spaghetti or you make sandwiches out of it. Like I saw, I don't know if it was Dietz and Watson or some company was advertising this clearly very like 1950s, 60s version of Halloween food. So I think that tends to be a lot of the modern Halloween food is make it something gross, right? But that wasn't really the case in the period. A lot of Halloween menus and Halloween foods in the period were based very much on seasonal ingredients. That was like the one route you could take. Seasonal ingredients like with a party, generic party twist. And then the other route was like color themes and making things with Halloween motifs on them, right? So typical party foods that were seasonal associated with Halloween were, as I said, donuts, gingerbread, salted nuts, right? Because the fall is like nut harvest time. And that's actually another version of Halloween. You might have nutting parties, right? Where you would go out and harvest nuts. That was a thing that people did. And there's all sorts of other lore directly associated with that. The chestnut divination on the hearth is kind of part of that, but there's lots of other versions. Like, you know, you can make little boats out of walnut shells and put them afloat either in a stream or in a bowl of water. And if they stay together, that means you're going to have a long relationship. And if they go apart, that means your relationship's not going to work out, right? All kinds of fun stuff with that. So nuts definitely our theme. Apples, pumpkins, obviously grapes, which is not really something I think that we associate with Halloween anymore, but particularly in the Northeast, Concord grapes and a bunch of other more historic grape varieties instead of the modern table grapes, you know, red and green table grapes that we associate with that come from California, Mexico, South America. Grapes in the 19th and early 20th century were largely Concord grapes. You might have Niagara grapes, which still grow in this region. I've had them. They're very delicious. They're like a kind of a golden color, very soft with seeds in the middle. And then there's like the very fancy Tokay grapes. I'm totally blanking. Somebody help me. The very famous southern grapes, Scuppernong grapes, are associated with this time period as well and this season. So those are all kind of the seasonal foods. Apple cider, not so much hard cider at the turn of the 20th century because, of course, Prohibition, right? But grape juice, hot cider, spiced grape juice, that kind of thing. Welsh rarebit, right? Anything that involves an open fire, you know, toasted sausages, Welsh rarebit, which is like melted cheese that you serve on toast. Sometimes it's like a cheese sauce, like chafing dish type things. Chafing dishes are very popular in the 1890s, and they kind of got a revival in the 1920s. That's like a freestanding. They kind of look like, if you've ever been to a catering event, you know, the hotel pans with the little sterno under them. It's kind of like that, but it's for tableside cooking. Welsh rarebit was a very popular version of that. And then you get things like, you know, ham or sausages and pickles and donuts. And like that was a great kind of outdoorsy bonfire type menu. You do also get more conventional party menus. Like when I was doing research for the packet, I went through my cookbook collection looking for Halloween recipes. Surprisingly, not as many as you would think. And a lot of them were just menus. And a lot of the menus were just very straightforward, like party foods. Like, you know, creamed chicken in little puff pastry cups. Or lobster Newburg. I was like, how does that have anything to do with Halloween? So very typical, regular party foods that weren't necessarily Halloween themed were also kind of in play. The other route you could take, besides seasonal, pumpkin pie, stuff like that, pies, apple pies, ginger snaps, all those sort of fallish things were happening. The other tack you could take was a color theme. So color theme parties are still a thing. I had a very vintage Halloween party last year that I posted about on my blog. And I decided for that, I was just going to do color themed food, and I just did snacky things. It was great. I posted a bunch of recipes last year if anybody wants to check it out. Sadly, no Halloween party this year. This is my Halloween party. So I'm not making lots of food or anything this year. But you can go with the color theme. So that really resulted in, you know, orange things and black things, or purple things. So orange things would be like pumpkin and squash, obviously, carrots, oranges, the fruit, which somebody pointed out on, I think it was on Facebook, that the color orange didn't exist before the fruit. Before that, it was called red yellow, or yellow red. So oranges themselves, obviously. And then you get a lot of orange tinted things. Oh, I forgot apricots, dried apricots, canned apricots, apricot jam, marmalade, that sort of thing. But then you got orange tinted things. Like you get a lot of cakes with orange frosting, cookies with orange frosting, that sort of thing. The black was almost always chocolate, which by the end of the 19th century, we had perfected cocoa production, right? Making chocolate cakes extremely accessible because you could use dried cocoa. You no longer had to buy and melt baking chocolate. So you start to get a lot of chocolate cakes, and chocolate cake with orange flavored or orange tinted frosting becomes very popular. Just regular cakes that maybe you'd put a chocolate black cat on, or a bat, or you would make it look like a jack-o'-lantern, right? That was Halloween-y enough. When I did black, you don't see this as often. Chocolate is definitely the most popular black stand-in and color-themed parties. But occasionally you'll see like spice cakes and gingerbread, which were very popular fall foods in general that became associated with Halloween. And every once in a while you'll see blackberry as an option. But mostly the black color is chocolate. Oh, and you bring up the etymology of orange with William of Orange. We're not going to get into that. I had a little bit of an argument with somebody about the origin of orange carrots, which are apocryphally associated with William of Orange, and they actually predate Dutch patriotism around William of Orange. So we don't have orange carrots because of William of Orange. He may have popularized them. Dutch patriots may have popularized him, nationalists. But that's not where we get orange carrots from. Just as a little aside, Annie was like, I don't want to bore you with the etymology of the William of Orange and the Prince of Orange, but guess what? Tangent about carrots. Oh, interesting. Okay, Elizabeth says, I have a recipe from a 1920s cookbook for a Halloween cake, which is a spice cake with just enough cocoa in it to make it dark, and raisins and candied orange peel in the cake. That sounds fabulous, and a lot like election cake, which I think I will talk about at the end if we have time, since the election is next week, just in a couple days. So that was the color version of parties, right? And of course, the decorations were also very color oriented. If anybody is familiar, you can look them up online. There are a series of popular Halloween decoration books that were created by the Dennison Paper Company, who specialized in crepe paper, which was used a lot for all kinds of holiday decorations, but came to be associated pretty heavily with Halloween. And in order to market their crepe paper resources for Halloween, they created something called the Bogey Book. So Dennison's Bogey Books. They're published from about 1909 until the 1940s. There aren't very many of them available for free online. There's only like 3 or 4, all of them from the 20s. But essentially the book would have suggestions and illustrations for how to create really quite complex decorations for Halloween parties. They would also have recommendations for menus and have a couple of recipes usually in there and talk about favors and things like that. But the bulk of the book is about decorations, and there's some pretty crazy versions. So of course, crepe paper, most people know crepe paper as like the roll. It's kind of like crinkly, flexible paper, comes in all kinds of colors. But in the time period, and you can still get it today, although it's a little bit expensive, it also came in big sheets. And they would also do printed versions. Like they would do printed paper tablecloths. And you could get printed paper that you could turn into bunting and curtains and centerpieces and whatever else you wanted to do with it. And so the Bogey Books, it's hard to tell whether or not they're capitalizing on the popularity of Halloween parties or if they're sort of responsible for the popularity of Halloween parties. I think it's probably a little bit of both. But they're super fun if anyone wants to look them up. Archive.org has one from 1920. And the Haughty Trust, however you pronounce it, has a couple from the mid-20s, I think one from 24 and one from 26. Hatha Trust also has a number of other Dennison's books for other holidays, which is kind of fun. If anybody wants to look up 1920s holiday decorations, that's definitely the place to do it. So the other thing that's happening with menus besides color themes is people are trying to make things look Halloweenish. And one of the most popular, besides, you know, like cupcakes with jack-o'-lanterns on them, or making your cake look like a jack-o'-lantern or whatever, is celery brooms. So you would take a strip of celery, probably fill it with something like a cheese mixture or maybe peanut butter, you know, if you're going to do ants on a log. But then you would leave the end of it unfilled, and with a sharp knife, you would kind of like shred it into fringe. And before you filled the celery, you would soak the celery with the cut fringe in cold water, and the ends would curl up. And so it would look like little witches' brooms. And that was a popular party food appetizer kind of thing for Halloween parties, was it looked like witches' brooms. So another one that I haven't talked about is popcorn and the dreaded popcorn ball, right? So in the 19th century in particular, molasses taffy and molasses cooked to softball stage with butter and then used to make popcorn balls were pretty popular kind of autumnal wintertime parties. You would have in the Victorian period taffy pulls. So if anybody's ever made homemade taffy candy, which you can totally do, especially if you have a candy thermometer, it's a little harder before the thermometers. You have to use either a plate, a cold plate, or cold water. If you've ever heard of cooking sugar to the softball stage, that's when you drop some of it in cold water and it becomes like a soft ball. And then there's also, I think, like the hard crack stage, right, for making hard candies. But so people would make taffy out of molasses, sometimes sugar, but molasses was a very popular one because it was so inexpensive, because you need kind of a lot of it to make candy, right? So you cook the molasses to usually softball stage, depending on the recipe. And then you pour it out onto a buttered surface. And once it starts to cool down enough so that you can handle it without burning yourself horribly, then you would have multiple people and you would stretch the candy between you and then fold it and stretch again and fold it and stretch again. And what you're doing is you're working air into the candy, which makes it light and makes it a little chewy. So the more you pull and stretch, the more air you work into it, the lighter it gets. And that was a popular pastime as a party because it's something that you can all do together, and it takes more than one person. And it's kind of like, then at the end, when you're all tired and your arms are tired from pulling and you're maybe hot and a little sticky, then you can sit down and eat the candy, maybe with donuts and pickles and popcorn, right? So that was something that people did, not necessarily associated with Halloween, but it became kind of a thing to do on Halloween. And popcorn balls, which is where you take freshly popped popcorn and mix it with, like a hot cooked molasses or kind of a caramel. Nowadays, a lot of people make it with corn syrup, right? So that when that starts to come around in the turn of the 20th century, that becomes a popular stand-in for molasses because it's not as highly flavored, right? You can add whatever flavoring you want to it. So those kind of remain popular throughout. So any questions before we start talking about trick-or-treating? You guys have been kind of quiet in the comments. But I've also been talking a lot, right? All right, well, if you have any questions, you can ask as we go. So one of the things I said earlier is that trick-or-treating is not really a super recent invention, right? So if you can't go trick-or-treating this year, don't feel super bummed out about it. Emulate the turn of the century parties and have a little party at home with your kids or your spouse or yourself. You could have a little Zoom party, right? Kind of like we're doing now. Because trick-or-treating is more recent than a lot of people think. So as I said earlier, it has kind of this association with the poor praying for the souls of the departed in exchange for food, right? It has associations with Twelfth Night and mumming and wassailing. Everybody loves my hair tonight. Rita just commented. It's very sweet of you guys, especially because I was like, it's sort of all over the place. So thank you for your compliments. So trick-or-treating is kind of comes out of those traditions, and it becomes more and more popular in the late 19th and very early 20th century. But in a lot of communities, the trick is more popular than the treat, right? It becomes sort of a free-for-all for purportedly juvenile delinquents, right? A lot of teenage boys going around and playing pranks on their community. Stuff like, you know, putting cars on top of buildings, or, you know, stealing things and hiding them, or taking the hinges off of a door so when you try to open it just falls out, you know, that kind of stuff. It did also get a little bit more violent than that. Things like breaking windows, stealing furniture and pieces of buildings and making bonfires in the middle of the street. Random gangs of teenage boys roaming around and beating people up. So by the time we get to the Great Depression and kind of coming out of the Great Depression, it really has become sort of a crisis in a lot of communities. And more public trick-or-treating becomes sort of the solution to that, right? So parents going out with young children, going from door to door, the community being home and observant, kind of starts to put a damper on some of the more juvenile delinquent versions of trick-or-treating. And then, of course, post-war, once we start to get the post-war housing boom and you get suburbs, so you have large numbers of people with young children moving into communities, you see more and more trick-or-treating. Trick-or-treating starts to be commercialized. Commercial candy, right? People start to buy prepackaged, individually wrapped candies to give away at Halloween instead of things like, you know, cookies and apples and popcorn balls and things like that that had been more popular previously. So post-war, you start to get more commercialized things. People's costumes start to get more commercialized. There are some really great images floating around the internet from the 1940s and 50s that you start to see kind of a mix. There's homemade costumes, there's store-bought costumes, and then there's a mix of the two. And the store-bought portion is usually masks, right? And there are some creepy masks out there from trick-or-treating. Holy crap, you guys. I'm so glad that costumes, and like unintentionally creepy, right? Kind of like President Rubber Mask creepy. So that just continues in popularity from the 1950s through to today, to where Halloween is almost exclusively associated with trick-or-treating instead of with parties, which is where it really starts. These community parties, these parties for children, for young people, to get together and kind of celebrate in the fall. So Elizabeth has a question. She says, was candy making as big of a thing in the UK as it was in the US? Candy recipes seem to be all over American cookbooks from the 19th, early 20th century, but I haven't seen many in English cookbooks. That is a very good question. And the answer is I'm not really quite sure. So I think part of it has to do with Britain tends to, I think, have more domestic service later than the United States does. And also it's a smaller country. So I think perhaps it's easier to buy store-bought candies and cakes and things like that. Whereas in the United States, I think there's more of an emphasis on making your own because you weren't necessarily able to do that. But that's something that I would have to look into because that hadn't occurred to me. Most of my cookbooks, as you can see, the vast majority of my cookbooks are American cookbooks. I do have some British and Irish cookbooks from the turn of the 20th century. Actually, let me check I have a cookbook. Where is it? Yes. I have a couple historic ones. Because if anybody's going to have Halloween recipes, it's going to be the Irish, right? So I have Moral Laverty's Cookery Book, which I'm pretty sure is Irish. This one is from 1946. And let me just see. I think part of it might also be that Brits are much more into puddings. Right. I mean, not necessarily pudding as in like just generic dessert term, but actual baked and steamed puddings when we are in the United States. So maybe there's not as much room for candy. I'm not sure. All right. That has no candy recipes in it. And this one is Success Cookery by Anne Beaton from... It's Roman numerals, which I hate. So I don't know exactly when, but I'm assuming it's mid-century. There is a whole section called For Men Only. What's in the For Men Only section? Is this like directed at men? Oh, for men living alone. How they can cook for themselves. That's adorable. I don't know why they just couldn't use the rest of the cookbook, but that's very sweet that it's directed at them. Yeah, no candy in here either. So, right, so fudge, butterscotch taffy, I think those are pretty distinctly American candies. I think probably most of the candies that you're going to see in Europe are chocolate, and then maybe more like hard candies or like pastilles, things like that. But it might have a lot to do with like the tea cake, the cake and pudding obsession and biscuit obsession in the UK. All right, Andy says, what are the Roman numerals? Decipher these for me because my brain is not working super great. Oh, maybe it's 1952. MCM LII. MCM LII. Is that 1952? I think so. I think so. Every time I see Roman numerals, my brain just like goes blank because it's like panicking. What? I don't know what those are. I can't decipher it. So Andy, you'll tell me if that's 1952. All right. So I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the Halloween edition of Food History Happy Hour. If you joined us late, I made the Stone Fence cocktail, and I haven't finished it because I've been too busy talking, but it is 1 ounce of spiced rum and pretty much a whole 12-ounce bottle of hard cider. Thank you, Andy. It's 1952. I feel redeemed now with my deciphering of Roman numerals. So any last questions before we adjourn for the evening? I hope you guys maybe got some inspiration for what you could do for your own Halloween at home. It snowed here today, and so a bunch of my friends, a couple of my friends were joking. One that Mother Nature is going as winter for Halloween, which I thought was pretty cute. And the other one was that even Mother Nature is participating in Christmas creep this year. Oh, Cammie, thank you for reminding me. What is election cake? So election cake is a New England tradition and it's based in the medieval great cakes tradition of Europe. So it's basically a giant fruit cake. And when I say giant, I mean giant. I was looking up recipes to see if I could find one to maybe make on Tuesday because I have Tuesday off. So I'm going to vote with a friend. I haven't voted yet. I'm waiting for actual election day. I thought maybe I would celebrate by making an election cake. But most of the recipes are like, start with 6 pounds of flour. It's like, even though I have 6 pounds of flour in my house right now, I am not making a cake with 6 pounds of flour. So clearly these election cakes are designed to make many cakes or one giant cake, and it's for community celebrations. And it's a tradition that they did for a number of holidays dating back to kind of Puritan New England. So Election Day was a super important holiday. I think it's called Mustering Day, which is like the annual meeting of the militia, right? Was an important day. And then there's another one, which I'm forgetting. But I'm sure if you look it up, you'll find it. So election cakes are basically a type of fruit cake. It's kind of like a spice cake, a yeasted spice cake. That's the important thing. It has to be yeast risen. And then it has dried fruit in it, usually raisins and citron. Like we don't get too super fancy, but raisins and citron and spices. And then it's a very dense but yeast risen cake. So it's not quite as dense as fruit cake, like Christmas associated fruit cake that we're used to. And then it usually has wine of some sort, like port or Madeira or regular wine, and rum in it. Not a ton, and it's usually in the batter, not soaked with it afterwards. So that's election cake. So if you want to take a stab at it, there are a couple modern iterations online. I was trying to find a historic one that wasn't totally crazy. I did find one in an 1890s cookbook that I have, but it still calls for 4 pounds of flour. I did find one that called for a quart of flour, but then you're supposed to use a pint of homemade potato yeast. So we'll see. I might just make a spice cake and call it election cake. Or some gingerbread or something and put some raisins in it and call it election cake. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But that's a little bit of the history behind election cake. If I have time, I might do a blog post on it if I make an actual cake. So we'll get a little more history in there. And then for those of you who missed it, I did do a blog post on one particular Halloween candy known as Mary Jane's, or Mary Jane's Peanut Butter Kisses, which if you've ever seen the black and orange taffy that's wrapped in wax paper, there was a meme going around about, oh, this is so awful that it doesn't even have a name. It does have a name, and it's just awful because the stuff you've had is old. But that is a molasses taffy with peanut butter in it, and there's a couple different versions. So if you want to know more about that, you can check it out on my blog at thefoodhistorian.com. And if we don't have any other questions, I'll take a little sip, give people some time to answer or to ask. This is really good, guys. If you like hard cider, I do recommend the Stone Fence, which is pretty tasty. All right, well, if that is all the questions we have for tonight, I think we're going to be done. Thank you, everybody who joined me for this latest episode of Food History Happy Hour. I'm not exactly sure when the next episode is going to be because I have some stuff coming up on Fridays, but I will announce soon when the next one will be in November. We're definitely going to talk about Thanksgiving, and we're definitely going to talk about indigenous foods because November is National Native American Month. So have a happy Halloween, everybody. Tomorrow night, I hope you have a great time. Whatever you choose to do, maybe you just stay at home and make a stone fence and wear a witch hat. So yeah, thanks again for joining. I'm Sarah Wasberg Johnson, and we'll see you next time.